in terms of like the mega churches and in terms of the really like overemphasis on trying to make you like feel a certain way, because they want you to think that if you feel a certain way, that's God. Okay, so a good counter to that, certainly, just as we talked about today, is in the sermon, is what Jesus is talking about, the voice of the shepherd, that he doesn't mean an inner voice. Like, it's his voice, it's his word. Everything's about the word and the gospel. Today, we're going to look at rationalism and empiricism. And I'm not putting this fully up on the screen like the whole slideshow quite yet, because I'm going to have to go out of this in order to show you a couple of videos to get started that are a really good example of this. But let's do that first. So we get to watch videos. So the kids are all trying to get Maria to do all that. They're like, let's watch YouTube videos. We are going to watch YouTube videos. Only my thing is being weird. Hold on. Display settings. There we go. All right. First, I don't know if any of you guys have seen this version of Sherlock Holmes from Netflix series. It came out a few years ago. I was having some trouble with the quality of the audio on this. Oh, come on. Don't do that to me. I've been having trouble with it, like weird things with some websites this morning here at church. I don't know why. Let's try to reload. Great, thanks. Apparently I'm going to have to, all right? Like, we have these videos. Do you think this one will play? I'm going to guess that will be a no. Here's another one that's a good example of what we're going to look at. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. Whatever. All right. So I guess we'll just have to, like, explain what I mean to you then, which is a bummer. Good examples. But start this. Yeah, there's something weird going on. I think it's just I don't know what it is with. I don't know if it's with the websites or if it's with the internet here at church this morning, because I wasn't having these troubles at home, but I don't know. Anyway, so rationalism and empiricism, they kind of fit together. And rationalism is the principle or habit of accepting reason as the supreme authority in matters of opinion, belief, or conduct. The idea that you can find the answer to nearly anything simply by following certain rules of thought. René Descartes said famously, "I think, therefore I am." And that's what he meant. It's talking about it's all about reason. Science is really what we're talking about when we're talking about also empiricism. So skip it ahead and to kind of combine these. So empiricism would be like the doctrine that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. So Sherlock Holmes and The Martian, those are the two clips I was going to show you. And the Sherlock Holmes one, it's from that newer Netflix one with Benedict Cumberbatch, which is a really great show. Rachel's a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. I like Sherlock Holmes a lot too. And he's really fun to watch. One of the things that's fun about it is the way he solves these mysteries, right? He makes these wild deductions, but they're not wild. They're purely rational. It's why he's always saying to Watson, "Elementary, my dear Watson." He's just thinking through the steps. He's applying rationalism. Now, he's applying it, generally speaking, in the way it's meant to be. Rationalism and empiricism, if we take off the ism at the end, if we just say reason and empirical science, you're talking about two very good things. This is just an ordered, structured like study of the world and the use of the laws of logic. By the way, both of those things imply the existence of God. The fact that everything is ordered, the fact that there is such a thing as a universal law of logic. C.S. Lewis did a good job of bearing this out. I think it was in Mere Christianity, his book, proves that there's someone who made it. Like the fact that we can examine everything and find rules that always apply, that you can like measure what's the force of gravity and blah, 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 right? All these different things. You could not do science if it was not a fact that someone had created the world with certain laws, the universe with certain laws, etc. You could not think properly, right, without that. So Descartes might say, "I think, therefore I am," but Jesus just says, "I am, and therefore you think." Well, anyway, the clip from Sherlock Holmes, he shows this. It's this opening scene. He's making these, deductions like he usually does, and it's when he meets Watson for the first time. This is a newer version. It's like set in the modern day. So Watson is he had been in the war in Afghanistan, and Holmes meets him for the first time, and he's like, you were in Afghanistan, and all these kinds of things. But also in the same clip, he shows what is kind of like the trademark, hallmark weakness of Sherlock Holmes. What's that? Anybody know? If anybody's familiar with Sherlock Holmes as a character? What's kind of always his character flaw, his big bugaboo? He does not get emotion very well. He doesn't pick up on it very well. He's not tactful, right? He's not really tuned into that sort of thing at all. And it causes him to miss things sometimes, and it causes him to really annoy people a lot of times, right? And that's kind of part of what makes the shows work. It's funny. Some of you also, by the way, another example of this sort of relationship, you guys watch the TV show House? Okay? That's Holmes Watson. That's what that is. That's why they're called House and Wilson. It's not they did that on purpose. House is the Sherlock Holmes character just made into a doctor. And the same exact kind of thing. Makes these startling, pronouncements about various things. Always kind of fun to watch. And then the interplay between them, right? Wilson and Watson are the ones who are a little bit more down to earth and more understanding of other people and that sort of thing. Well, my point with that is that it's a good example of a lot of the things that reason can do, but also of how reason alone can miss some things. And it can miss some important things if you're thinking that reason alone. So rationalism being the idea that reason alone can find all truth. And empiricism being that empirical science, testing, studying, etc., can find all truth. The Martian was the other clip I was going to show you. I don't know if any of you have seen that movie. It's got that's Matt Damon, right? I think, yeah. Great movie. He's an astronaut. He's on Mars. Bunch of bad stuff happens, and he's trying to do it just stay alive until a shuttle can come, and he keeps finding these problems, and then he keeps solving, right? And his point is, just do the math, basically. Let's face the problem, do the science, etc. And it's a cool example of that. And it's a great example of how science is good and how it works, right? But empiricism, again, is when it's overstepping its bounds, when it is thinking that it can know all things, even things that it can't actually apply the empirical method to. But people do this. So people often talk in our culture, especially if they disagree with you. They'll just say, well, science has proved that you're wrong. First of all, usually the people who say this are not scientists. They just say, science has proved. And a lot of times they're talking about some things that maybe aren't exactly all that proved. Sometimes they're talking about things where they're straight up wrong, and then other times they start talking about some subject where science, actually empirical science and reason, isn't actually on their side, and all of a sudden they don't talk about science anymore. So a good example of that being when you talk to somebody about abortion, guess what they don't bring up? They don't bring up science. If you talk to them about something else, right? Maybe it's whatever, I don't know. I'm not taking a position on any of this, but on this, say it's global warming. They're always talking about science, right? The same exact person, you turn the topic to abortion, not a single word. And if you want to try to bring it up, they don't want to have anything to do with it. Because it's not on their side, right? That's what humans are like. That's what our sinful nature is like. We only like to use things as evidence when it is for us, and then we discount it. That's a logical fallacy, by the way. It's called stacking the deck, right? When you only use the arguments that are in favor of your position, which is very irrational. But it's what we're like. We are not very rational by nature. We're not good at being unbiased and rational in that way. All right, so a lot of good examples of things that reason and empirical science have done. Sewer systems, that's pretty good. Electricity, it's really good. The internet, right? It works, right? Warm homes, clean water, reliably safe food, medicine. There's all kinds of really, really good things. The Holmes and the Martian are both good examples of people who are outstanding in their field, which reminds me of the joke. Why did the Scarecrow receive a medal? Because he was outstanding in the field, in his field. So again, you can think about all things that have been proved or helped by these things, how much better off we are today in lots of earthly ways compared to, say, the Middle Ages. just because in the Middle Ages they didn't do a whole lot of either of these things, right? And people like to say that the reason, people who are not believers like to say that the reason for that darkness of the Middle Ages was Christianity. No, it was not. Anybody know a good way to disprove that idea? Does anybody know what really, more than anything, led to the scientific really awakening that brought an end to the Dark Ages, into the constant speeding up of science and reason and technology? Where'd that come from? How'd that happen?
Well, did it come from many of the monks and
They did some things, but I think more than anything, it's the Reformation. The Reformation and the Renaissance are at the same time. They're feeding into each other, right? But they share something very much in common. And that was, at that time, it was called a humanist. Luther was a humanist. Today, he wouldn't be a humanist. Today, you're talking about a humanist, and you mean somebody who thinks that, like, humans can save themselves, basically, or they don't need a god, or blah, blah, blah. Back then, being a humanist was opposed to the scholastics. And the scholastics were the guys who were like, hey, instead of studying the Bible, we're going to study the writings of this guy who wrote about the writings of this guy, who wrote about the writings of that guy, who wrote about the writings of those people who wrote about the Bible. Idiotic, right? So the humanists and the Renaissance people, they were all about going back to the original texts, going back to the source of things, going back to the study. So, like, for instance, the poets, they'd be going back to study the actual writings of, people like Homer, right? And the biblical scholars, like, we got to go back and study the Bible in its original languages. And that's what Luther and Melanchthon were doing. And this is what led them to, lo and behold, finding out what the Bible actually says. Instead of just reading a bunch of stuff that a bunch of people who didn't really understand the Bible were writing about the Bible. The same thing's happening in music and in the arts and everything. Well, that's just reason. That's what that is. Like, reason isn't bad. Reason gets bad when it goes out of its field. Okay, we're going to talk more about that. But reason is a gift from God. We need reason to understand the words of the Bible, right? It's words. You don't understand words without reason. We use it all the time. What we use it for is to understand, but we leave it behind when it comes to believing, right? Because when we understand what the words have said, then if reason is like, okay, I'm still going to be the controlling factor here, then we're going to be like, well, that doesn't make sense to me. That's not the point. Once we know what the Bible says, that's for faith. Faith believes what God says, but we use reason to understand what it says. So anyway, there's all kinds of good examples of that. And like I was saying, you have the Renaissance, you have the Enlightenment. All of these things are coming from these ideas of just like using your brain, right? And you think about all of these major scientists in like the 16th and 17th century, famous guys like Galileo, Nicholas Copernicus, Isaac Newton. Guess what all those people were? They were all Christians. So this idea that Christians are the ones that cause this darkening is ludicrous. Makes no sense at all. It is partly the Catholic Church's fault. That is what caused the darkening of the gospel itself in the Dark Ages. Because they were doing exactly what I was just telling you about. They weren't allowing people to go and read the Word. They didn't encourage people to be like learning how to read. They didn't want the Bible in people's actual language so they could understand it, right? And this darkening effect, this chilling effect, like discounting people from like studying things and understanding things, it got pretty ridiculous. Do you know the whole idea that you maybe learned when you were a kid? How many of you learned as a kid that at the time of Christopher Columbus, most people thought that the world was flat? How many of you learned that as a kid? I did. That's baloney. That's not true at all. Basically everyone knew the world was round. They had for a long time. The Greeks calculated the circumference of the earth to a very close degree. They knew this stuff. Columbus thought the Greeks were wrong. And he thought the earth was much smaller than it was. So his idea was that he thought he would actually be able to sail around it. They're all thinking, if it's this big, it'll take so long to sail all the way around, it wouldn't be a good idea, which they were right about, right? They didn't know that North America was here. Columbus wasn't some revolutionary genius. He was an idiot who got lucky. I'm serious. That's what happened. He was wrong, and if he had been right, he and all the people on his boats would have died on the way around the world because it would have been too long, right? So My point is simply that, like, you hear a lot of these things that are just like, oh, you know, Christianity caused the Dark Ages, and now we have science, and it displaced. Christianity brought about science, but now it's like it's a child that's grown up and gotten rebellious and has forgotten where it's come from and is stepping out of its place. And that's really what we're kind of looking at with these things. There's a quote from Shakespeare in Hamlet: "There are more things in heaven and on earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." Meaning, there are things beyond what reason and empirical science can know. An example. Looks like a pretty good place to be right now. Imagine you lived on such an island. This is Fiji, I believe. And imagine you lived there and you had always lived there. And everyone you knew had always lived there. No one had ever left your island, and no one had ever come to your island from anywhere else. At least not as far as anyone could remember. If someone asked you to draw a picture of the world, what would you draw?
An island.
You draw your island, right? If somebody asked you to write a textbook about all the plant life in the world, it would be about the plant life on your island. Or about the animals. It'd be about the animals on your island, or about culture, or about music, or about history. It would all just be what's on your island. That's all that you could do. You're being entirely rational and empirical. Now, there are some conclusions you could draw. Like, there's all kinds of things you wouldn't know. You probably wouldn't know what snow is. I'm pretty sure it doesn't look like a place where they ever get snow. Okay? Your reason would be the same. Your ability to observe things would be the same, but the conclusions you could draw would often be like incomplete. Now, if you were really unbiased and really like rationally rigid, not rigid, rationally like honest, there are several conclusions you could draw as possibilities. It would be entirely rational for you to say that there might be other places, and that those other places might have different types of plant life, but you couldn't know that, right? And so they can only be used for that which is within the realm of human reason and in the natural world. So think of it like they can only be used for what's on their island. Reason and empirical sense cannot be used for anything beyond that island. By definition, anything beyond that is beyond the ability of reason or science to say anything about. They have no reason or ability either to understand or accept or reject anything beyond their island, like the flying spaghetti monster. I don't know if you guys have heard of this. Some people who are like, atheists like to make fun of Christians, and the idea that of exactly what I'm talking about right now. If I brought this up to somebody like this and I was saying, like, look, you want to say that like science, because they love to say science and reason prove that there's no God, which is a ludicrous statement, right? The very idea of there being a God is, for the most part, we're going to get to one caveat with this, beyond the island of reason and empirical science. If you can't see him, you can't test him. Now, one caveat, which I already mentioned, is that our ability to actually do these things rationally tells us that there must be a God. But it's really easy for people to reject that when they don't want to believe that there's a God. So anyway, they'll bring up this fine spaghetti monster. They'll say, no one, I hope no one actually believes this, but there's a group of people who are like, oh yeah, we worship the flying spaghetti monster. And they're trying to claim, like, I can just claim that anything exists and you can't disprove it. So because you can't disprove it, they're saying that's the same thing as Christianity. But it's not the same thing as Christianity. Not at all. It is the same thing as every religion besides Christianity. Most religions are very careful to not make claims that can be either proven or disproven. And when they have, then they become a laughingstock. You think of any examples of religions that have made claims that are disprovable and then have been disproven? I'll give you one, because it's hilarious.